Thank you for this. I'm also the only obstacle between the conference and the mince pies, wines, and juices. But many thanks, Tim, for your very kind words. And of course, none of what we do as experts to the UN would be possible without the kind of great research that Tim Lang and others produce. What I would like to do in the few minutes I have to conclude is essentially to go through the various solutions that have been explored in the course of today. And recalling very briefly, although I know that we are beyond this and that this should not be recapitulated once again, first recall what the problem is so that we have a common understanding of where the obstacles are. Now, very briefly, it seems to me that we can trace back many of the difficulties we have discussed to the low-cost food economy that has developed. By this I mean that it's an economy that was directed by one obsession of governments, entirely understandable, which was to reduce the percentage of the household budget going to be spent on food by supporting any policies that could reduce that cost for families. That was a program of food policies since the 1950s. That was really at the heart of the Common Agricultural Policy, for example. And we managed pretty well to achieve this. On average, the households in our European society spend 12-13% of their budget on buying food, which is less than half what they spent after the Second World War. This was achieved by repressing the wages of farm workers, by lowering the farm gate prices received for their crops by farm producers who only can stay in business thanks to the subsidies that they receive. And this was also achieved by subsidizing the use of inputs by farmers and subsidizing the production of commodities that are the inputs for the food processing industry. And of course, in this quest for low-cost food, we neglected the various negative externalities that would result from those choices. Environmental externalities, of course, that have been discussed during part of the day. Soil water pollution, the loss of biodiversity, greenhouse gas emissions, we know all of this. Social impacts, with bigness, economies of scale being rewarded and small farms disappearing. We lose every week over the past 10 years 43 farms in Belgium alone, for example, and I don't have the figure for the UK, but it probably is even larger. And of course, we have major health impacts. These cheap calories are low quality calories, and they accelerate the epidemics of non-communicable diseases linked with unhealthy eating habits. Now, these are consequences that governments cannot ignore anymore. Today in the EU, for example, 7% of the healthcare budgets go to treating obesity-related diseases, type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular diseases, gastrointestinal cancers, for example, causing 2.8 million deaths per year in the EU, and 1 in 3 children in the EU a few years ago, when this was assessed, was overweight or obese. This particularly has an impact on low-income families. The impacts are not limited to our societies, since of course the low-cost food economy leads also to export foodstuffs on global markets, repressing artificially the prices on those markets and leading small-scale farmers in developing countries to have to compete on their own markets with these products that are dumped on those markets and drive them out of business. And this slide, which I don't have much time to comment, is really one short summary of how rural poverty has been produced in the developing world, in which most hungry people live, many of which depend on small-scale farming for a living. They have had to compete with export-led agriculture. In addition to the environmental, social, and health impacts, we have these impacts on the developing world. It's therefore a problem that has a global dimension to it. Now, in a way, the crisis is such that we see emerged new opportunities for transformation and for reform. New alliances are being built between actors who in the past were not working together. For example, environmental NGOs can team with concerned scientists to challenge the environmental consequences of this low-cost food economy. We have farm workers' unions, farmers' unions teaming with development NGOs to denounce the social impacts of the low-cost food economy that we've developed. And we have healthcare practitioners speaking to politicians concerned about public budgets and teaming with consumers' organizations in order to address the health dimensions. And all these groups are working together to demand reform. So in a way, because of this strong consensus on there being not a problem, but many problems, because of these new alliances, one would hope, one would think that change is on the way and easy to achieve. Not so, however. We have, in fact, 4 lock-ins in the system that make change extremely difficult to effectuate. First, we have sunk investments in technologies, in infrastructure, in machinery that reward one particular way of farming, of producing food that is large-scale, that is based on the production of commodities, that relies on monocultures that are easily mechanized. And those technological lock-ins are extremely difficult to displace, making it difficult for alternative food systems to develop, alternative ways of producing food, more precisely, to develop. Secondly, we have socio-economic lock-ins, major actors who are extremely good at producing at competitive prices, attractive to consumers, and who are so competitive because of the economies of scale they achieve, because of the logistics they can use, because of the network effects they can mobilize, that again, they crowd out the possibility for any alternative to emerge. And this socio-economic dominance translates in many cases into political dominance. Many of these actors have very strong veto powers on the political systems, particularly at national and European or international levels, less so though, and I will return to this point, at the local level where municipalities are concerned. But then finally we have social cultural lock-ins, and these are probably the most difficult to displace. The tastes of consumers, their habits, have been shaped and have shaped in turn what the food industry has been providing in terms of diets, in terms of foods, increasingly processed foods that are so convenient and so well suited to our lifestyles. We eat less and less like the Italians still eat. And of course, I'm not speaking here of families in developing countries who rely on subsistence agriculture. We eat more and more like this family in North Carolina that presents to this photographer what they have as a 1 week consumption in the family. Foods that have traveled long distances, that have been packaged, that have been frozen, that have been heavily processed, and that use lots of energy naturally for their production and for their conservation. The cultural lock-ins are also very strong because the foods that we have been accustomed to suit the fact that we work long hours, that we have long commuting times, that we have no time anymore to buy the right things and to cook meals and to enjoy meals even in families who, by the way, are smaller in size, often single-parent families where parents do not believe it's worth cooking at all for the children because it's such a burden on the normal the normal day of work. And I think this time poverty is one major reason why the cooking skills have been disappearing, and this has been deplored by some of you in the audience. So it is very difficult to change, and the real question is how to effectuate change. That is what most of the discussion today was about, and I will use a slightly different approach than the one of today, because I will be grouping together civil society, citizen-led transitions with the role of local authorities, because I believe it is that which is most promising. But let me begin with the level of the state. We expect a lot from the state. We expect the state to have the adequate regulatory framework. We expect from the state to have the right taxation and subsidy schemes to encourage healthy diets and sustainable food systems by providing the right economic incentives. And I believe the state has a lot to provide. The priorities, in my view, should be, first of all, as simple as this may sound, to shape a food policy. We have no such food policy in the UK. We have none in the EU, none at least that is worthy of the name. We have agricultural policies, environmental policies, we have health policies, education policies, but we have no food policy that cuts across these different policy areas and allows a coordinated approach towards something else. And that would be fine if it were simply to manage business as usual, if you wish. But if we want a large-scale transformation from farm to fork, as we say, then we need all these changes to be coordinated across these sectors, and only a full-fledged food policy can provide this. We also need a relocalization of food systems. And this is countering the dominant trend until recently we witnessed in the food sector, where chains have become longer and longer, where the distance between producers and consumers have been increasing over the years. And for the reasons I mentioned, I think it is the opposite we now need. We need to rebalance efforts towards rebuilding local food systems, and that is something certainly the state could support. And then we need greater equality. I mean by this that to a large extent, the low-cost food economy was a substitute for robust social policies. It is because we did not want to redistribute wealth. It is because we did not want to support poor families by strong social protection schemes that dumping cheap calories on markets was the most convenient solution. So we need prices that are right, certainly, that internalize the negative externalities so that the real price of food is understood by consumers. We want to avoid that taxpayers pay what consumers do not pay. But at the same time, we need to protect poor consumers from quality diets being unaffordable and to ensure that social policies are fair combined with prices becoming right. And I think that is the direction in which we have to go. I have no time to comment on this, so I'm just moving forward. How to make governments move? There are various strategies that are being developed, and I'd like to indicate perhaps three levers that could be used at international level. Firstly, Consumers International, with others, have proposed a new legal instrument, a framework convention to protect and promote healthy diets, which is interesting on two counts. First, it is designed, this convention, by analogy with the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control that was championed by the World Health Organization, and that, as you know, has been extremely influential in obliging governments to design action plans to discourage people from smoking and to reduce the attractiveness of consuming tobacco more generally by, for example, indications on tobacco packages, by better information to consumers, and so on. And the first reason why this is a useful analogy is because it raises the question of good food into a public health issue. Not just an issue of high-end consumers who are concerned about ethical dimensions, which it has been for a long while, but it's a public emergency given the impacts on health of the diets as they have evolved. And I think if the World Health Organization were taking this on board, it would be a very powerful message sent to the international community. And secondly, this convention, or this proposed convention, is interesting because it leaves lots of leeway to states as to at which speed they make progress towards realizing the aims of this convention. They simply are asked to design action plans to move towards protecting and promoting healthy diets with lots of freedom they retain to fit the local conditions. A second lever is the Committee on World Food Security. As you know, more and more attention is being given to this body in which civil society interacts with international agencies, the private sector, and governments to adopt broad-based recommendations as to how food systems should evolve. To a large extent, the Committee on World Food Security has been focusing up to now on production. Perhaps it should focus more efforts on consumption and diets. And thirdly, the scientific community certainly has a role. I was struck in my mandate as Special Rapporteur on the right to food by how little governments were listening to good science. They were listening to economic interests. They were concerned not to run counter to the expectations of the lobbies who have been capturing their attention, but there is no adequate link between the scientific community and the policymakers. And maybe we need something like an IPCC on food systems that would deliver regular reports to governments and also, as a priority perhaps, cost or rate the cost of doing nothing on food issues. But then there's also domestic pressure, and I believe very strongly in the importance of food democracy, of consumers and citizens building pressure on governments so that they take action for better diets that allow food systems to deliver not just food, but well-being instead. And I think food democracy is a hugely underestimated part of the answers that we are looking for, and that the governance of food systems should be reformed with this in mind. I shall return to this. Now, secondly, we discussed during the last segment of today the role of business. And let me summarize my views on this by saying it's very easy to be cynical about this, about the labels, about the codes of conduct, about supply chain management. It's easy to be cynical because the bottom line is the industry will be forced into action if this is rewarded by consumers and if their bottom line, that is their financial bottom line, of course, is indeed rewarded by this shift that is demanded from them. And it's true that we see many initiatives that are frankly not particularly effective nor particularly convincing. One of them is the pledge made in 2007 to reduce advertising towards children of less than 12 years of age. This is a well-known pledge adopted at EU level by a range of food and beverage companies, the logos of which you have before you. Now, 80% of the food and beverage industry has joined this pledge, and basically the pledge is not to advertise food or drink products to children below 12 years of age, unless these products fulfill specific nutrition criteria that are validated by the scientific community, and not to communicate about food products in primary schools. Now, this kind of pledge, although this is the best example we have in the world, is extremely weak considered from some perspectives. First of all, because children below 12 years of age will be influenced by the advertising going to children above 12 years of age, and to a large extent, they are the same audience than that the attention of which is captured by general marketing by the food and beverage industries. Secondly, because advertising is targeted in the pledge, but not the various marketing efforts of the industry that include sponsorship, product placement, and many other strategies. And thirdly, because although advertising in schools is renounced, is abandoned, this does not limit the exposure of children to unhealthy products on schools. And I think it would be a good place to begin. Schools where no soft drinks and no unhealthy snacks should be made available for children. I think it's an easy target that we can give ourselves. So it's easy to criticize these things. I think, however, it's by the same token important to realize that given the shape of food chains and the huge influence some companies at some segments of the chain exercise, if they can join in the fight for healthy diets, it can have immense impacts, whether these are retailers, large processors, given the dominant position that they occupy on the markets. And this is the well-known hourglass shape of the food chains in our wealthy societies, illustrating this very important target that these companies can represent. Now, thirdly and most interestingly, I think what we've heard is that there is a demand for something else than the state and for companies. People want not simply to be fed adequate diets. They want to invent their food systems or to reinvent them. And the transition towards healthy diets, towards sustainable food systems, maybe can be thought of as citizens-led in the future. I promote social diversity. By this I mean the proliferation of alternative food systems, transforming the nature of consumption into a political act. Because by consuming, when you have a choice, a real choice that is, you are actually voting with your pounds, with your dollar, for particular types of food systems. And that is what we are seeing. We see experimentation at local level with alternative food systems, often supported by hybrid forms of governance in which local authorities join efforts with private sector and with citizens' organizations in order to design alternative food systems. Why does this matter? Why do such social innovations matter? For essentially three reasons. First, because this is the best way to achieve cultural change, and cultural change is required for us to move to something healthier. Look, this is what we think of when we speak of food chains. We see a chain in which each of us, producer, consumer, retailer, occupy one position. And we seem to have no choice but to accept that we are part of a system, the general shape of which and the general outcomes of which we are powerless to influence. And I would like Hannah Arendt to be in this room and to reflect with us about the temptation to be bureaucratic about this. I mean by this to escape our responsibility, knowing the negative impacts of the food systems we depend on, but not accepting any individual responsibility for these food systems because we are just one small part of a much larger system. We have to force ourselves to accept our individual responsibility in making a change, and I think alternative food systems are a way to achieve this. This is important because social psychologists teach us, sorry, may I have some water? Yeah. Social psychologists teach us that we actually have, thank you. Thanks. We actually are very good at protecting ourselves from information that disturbs our lifestyles, that obliges us to rethink how we produce, how we consume, when these lifestyles are part of our identity. This is what, that's a bit mean, I guess, but this is what social psychologists call the the white male effect in risk perception. It's not by giving more information about climate change, about the ecological footprint of our diets, for example, that people will be shamed into doing something else. If this challenges their identity as affluent white males, they will not change. They must be convinced that this is something that is actually good for them and that is not threatening to them, this change that is demanded from them. And there are many studies showing that it's not that we need more information. We have all the information we need. We need to break down these barriers in our minds that make it difficult to have this cultural revolution within. This is confirmed also by psychologists such as Edward Deci and Richard Ryan from the University of Rochester, whose picture is here, and who show that when we are forced to do certain things by external regulations being imposed on us or by economic incentives, right, taxes, subsidies, we will not do things in the long term. We will try to escape the taxes. We will try to circumvent the regulations. Instead, when we do things because we believe they are the right thing to do, because they correspond to the image we want to project to others of ourselves, then we will hold on to certain types of behavior. We will be resilient in our commitment, and the long-term impacts, therefore, will be more noticeable. In other terms, our conduct will be transformed more in the longer run and more profoundly than if we are imposed certain types of behavior. Social innovations, such as those that have been discussed during the third part of this afternoon, are also important because they are a way to rebuild social links. And since there are many in the room who've been influenced, as I have myself, by the work of Tim Lang and the links between health and food that he discusses, I was struck to discover one day that actually the strength of social ties was a better predictor of long life expectancy than, for example, a reduced consumption of tobacco, alcohol, or even the healthy diets and not becoming obese. Many people who invest time and energy in these social innovations are people who find that it serves them well to build links with neighbors, to escape from isolation, and to rebuild a sense of community in hyper-individualized societies that are not just psychologically difficult to live with, but are also a burden on public health. And I think this is another reason why these social innovations are important. Thirdly, we discussed with Patricia Jaime, I hope this is the right pronunciation, the Brazilian food guide. Very impressive. And indeed, when I discussed this with Carlos Monteiro, I was really impressed, not just by the commitment that these people put into this effort, but by their vision that I hope will percolate in our societies too. Away from the triangle, away from a nutrients-based approach to quality diets, and towards recognizing that food is about culture, is about commensality, is about conviviality, is about how we eat, when we eat, and whom we eat with, rather than just about not falling dead because of not absorbing the right calories or the right micronutrients. I think a cultural shift is indispensable, and if people work together to redesign their food systems, to redefine their diets and to redefine the food systems on which they depend, I think it can serve this objective of moving away from how our diets have evolved up to now, and this is something I can not go into because it is simply summarizing again what Patricia Jaime mentioned earlier on. Another reason why social innovations matter in this area is because, of course, it can put pressure on dominant mainstream food systems. Now, it is quite remarkable that today retailers, food processors, as we saw in the last presentation by Mark Linehan, the restaurants and the catering industry, they care more and more about what consumers expect. And consumers do not expect simply cheap calories and a diversity of foodstuffs all year round. They ask questions about the ethics of their consumption, about the sustainability, about the impact on health and on soil of what they eat. I think this is one reason why these alternative food systems should be supported, because they can transform the mainstream food systems by putting pressure on them. I do not believe there will be one grand soir, if you wish, where there will be one food revolution leading to the dominant food system just falling apart. I do think that social diversity should be cultivated for the benefits that it provides. And finally, these innovations should allow the ecological logic to be increasingly decoupled from the economic logic. We have not discussed food production much today, yet it is both a huge challenge and something that consumers care about. But the real problem is that farmers, producers, are not incentivized by the markets on which they usually operate to produce in ways that respect the health of the soil, that preserve the ecosystems, and that reduce, in general, the ecological footprint of food production. The markets want large volumes of uniform stuff that the buyers of commodities can count on to feed the food processing industry with. It is very difficult to have diverse farming systems following the agroecological logic in which plants, trees, and animals complement each other in order to have balanced ecosystems, because the markets are simply not supportive of these efforts of food producers. So what can food producers do? Well, they redefine the markets on which they depend. They reinvent these markets with consumers with whom they team, for example, in community-supported agriculture schemes, in short food chains in general, defining their niche or their nested markets as alternatives to dominant markets on which otherwise they would depend. And rather than a long story, I'll just show you one scheme to illustrate this. This comes from the excellent work of my friend Jan-Door van der Ploeg from Wageningen University, who published in 2013 this book called The Art of Farming, a Shayanovian Manifesto. And in this book, he discusses agroecology as, if you wish, a way of farming that tries to respect the natural cycles of nature and try to define the loops in the production of food so that farmers produce their own inputs, recycle their waste, and try to close the loop as much as possible, replicating at farm level, if you wish, what we see in nature happening, i.e. the complementarity between plants, trees, and animals that modern agriculture has neglected in the name of simplifying the work of agricultural producers. That loop, that is the bottom of the scheme, however, is one that is very difficult to achieve if you have to follow the price signals of the market. Because if the market one day wants you to produce, say, more chicken, then you have to produce more chicken at the expense of the other things that on your diversified farm you would want to produce to maintain the ecological balance. And if you want to shift from soybean to maize, because the prices of maize have gone up, then again, you cannot maintain your diverse farming system as the ecological logic would require you to do so. And so there is an opposition between the economic logic, rewarding monocultures, rewarding uniformity, robbing, however, in the process, the soil from its nutrients, and finally the future generations from the ability to feed themselves well. And on the other hand, the ecological logic that new markets must serve to support. And Jan Douwe van der Ploeg, again, presented this work on nested markets, in which he and others document in Brazil, in China, in the EU, a range of social innovations in which the work of farmers changes because they invent or reinvent, one might say, the food systems on which they depend and the markets on which they sell. And so finally what we have is, if I may conclude thus, a tale of three transitions. First, we certainly need social innovations to be rewarded. We need a search for sustainable solutions. We do not know what can work in particular contexts, depending on the local resources available, depending on how communities are organized. Some things may work in Nottingham, which will not work in Oxford, for example. And we need to provide space for these social practices to develop, for people to experiment. We need to cultivate social diversity as a way to enlarge choices of people and to create opportunities for citizens' involvement. That is food democracy. It goes beyond just voting for the right political parties. It goes beyond being consulted on large projects. It means doing things rather than just giving a mandate for others to do things for you. And I think this is what we want to cultivate, reward, and what we actually see happening. This, however, requires a different type of governance. Not simply taxing and subsidizing, not simply providing the right regulatory framework, but also creating space for people to invent, for new food systems to emerge, for alternatives to develop, so that people can have a broader range of choices to choose from. This may mean hybrid forms of governance in which local municipalities team with local retailers and citizens in order to reinvent local food policies at the local level. That is what we heard from Oxford, for example, and what I think is extremely exciting and promising. And this, in turn, that's a third transition. And I'm delighted there are many researchers and students in the room. This, in turn, calls for researchers to work differently. Not just in laboratories anymore, but also with social actors to understand what are the obstacles they face, what are the tools they need, how we can learn from the social experiments that they lead in the different places in which these innovations take place. And ultimately, identifying the most promising avenues for change in order to avoid the sense of powerlessness, of immobility, of inertia, of citizens who basically decide what they want based on what is provided to them. Thank you very much.